faces, such as EJ. I'm really excited to tell you about the work that I've done here as a graduate student. So the title of my talk and the title of my thesis is Least Dilatation of Pure Surface Braids. And so I'll start by just kind of breaking down what I mean by that. So with an introduction, as is natural. So just to set the scenery, throughout the talk I'm going to let S sub Gn denote a connected oriented surface of genus G with end punctures. So here's a picture of that, genus G surface, end punctures. One thing to note throughout the talk, sometimes I'm going to denote my punctures with these like little circles, kind of like holes, and sometimes I'll just use black dots, because most of the time I can think of my punctures as mark points and vice versa, and so I won't always be clear about that distinction. So the main object that I'm going to be talking about is the end-stranded pure surface braid group of a surface of genus G. And I'm going to denote that by PV sub n of SG. And I'll define it to be the fundamental group of the configuration space of endpoints on a surface of genus G. And by the configuration space of endpoints on a surface of genus G, I mean distinct ordered n tuples of points on a surface. So this is kind of a natural generalization of the classical pure braid group, which is defined to be the fundamental group of the configuration space of endpoints in the complex plane. And so it's somehow something that maybe you want to think about. The pure braid group has been studied a lot in the past, so why not try to say something about what happens when we look on the surface? But the main setting that I'm going to be studying this in is the mapping class group. So the mapping class group is a really important group in my area, and we like to study it a lot. And so I'm going to define it as the group of orientation preserving homeomorphisms of my surface up to homotopy. And when I talk about homeomorphisms of a punctured surface, I want my homeomorphisms to preserve the set of punctures. And then I can consider a subgroup of the mapping class group, the pure mapping class group, which I denote Pmon of SGN, as the mapping classes which fix each puncture of SGN pointwise.
Oh, you mean in the first one you're allowed to map permute the points?
Yes, so in the first one, I'm preserving them as a set, but not pointwise. And so then I can consider the following short exact sequence. This is often known as the Berman short exact sequence. And this is built on using this map F, which I'll call the forgetful map. It's also called the fill in the puncture map. And it's the map from the pure mapping class group of a genus G surface with end punctures to a mapping class group of a closed surface. And it's just given by looking at a pure mapping class group and taking the map that's induced on the closed surface. And so then I have a kernel of this map, which is just going to be my pure braids, which are trivial on the closed surface. And then there's this great theorem of Berman, which says that when we have genus at least 2, then in fact the kernel of this forgetful map is isomorphic to the fundamental group of that configuration space I was talking about earlier. And so this gives me a way of thinking of my pure surface braids as mapping classes. And that's good, because these are the kinds of things I want to think about and talk about. So a really simple example of a pure braid would be if you just take your surface and you take some disk with at least 2 punctures, and then you look at the boundary of that disk and you just do a Dane twist about that. So you just take your disk, cut it out, twist it about 2 pi, and glue it back in. That's going to be something which doesn't really do anything to the rest of our surface, but anything that passes through here is going to kind of get twisted around that boundary. And when you fill in those punctures, that disk is going to be, the boundary of that disk is trivial. And so that's going to be something that will be isotopic to any on the closed surface. A slightly more exciting example is something called point pushing. And we can think of point pushing as kind of exactly what we think. So we could look at pushing a curve alpha along a closed loop beta along at a point, some point we want, just as follows. We literally just put our finger down on this mark point, and let's drag our surface along beta. And so we can see what that does to alpha by looking at the image. We just kind of drag it along until we come back to where we started. And so this is an example of again, a pure braid, because once we forget this puncture, right, we're just going to swing back around to the curve we had originally. And so on our closed surface, we didn't do anything. So this is kind of, both of these examples are kind of come back up later when we're kind of trying to construct these pure braids. So one of the fundamental results in this area is the Nielsen-Thurston classification of the mapping class group. And this picture kind of tells you what it is. It's a way of breaking down the mapping class group into these kind of 3 fundamental elements, or types of elements. Finite order, reducible, and pseudo-Naso. So finite order, like it sounds, is something which, when you raise it to a finite power, it's going to be isotopic to identity. So an example of that would be if you think of the genus 2 surface as a pentagon, right? A polygon with 10 sides, where you identify the parallel sides, and then you do a rotation of just by like 2 pi over 10. This is going to be something which, if you do it 10 times, you get back to the identity, you get back to yourself, and which doesn't fix any curves on my surface. So this is something that's finite order. Here we have an example of reducible. Again, we see this Dane twist, where we do like a Dane twist about this red curve. We just cut open our surface, twist by 2 pi, and glue it back together. This is going to be reducing because it fixes a reducing curve. So that's what we mean by reducible. There's some collection of simple closed curves on our surface which are fixed under the action of my mapping class. And then we can have things that are kind of both, right? This is an example, this rotation through 2 pi over 3, which is both finite order, right? We get back to ourselves after 3 times, and which fixes this collection of like reducing curves. And then we have kind of the complement of that, which is pseudo-Nadsovs. These are infinite order irreducible elements. So what is a pseudo-Nadsov? A pseudo-Nadsov is a mapping class which has a representative homeomorphism which comes equipped with a pair of transverse measured singular foliations. And F, our mapping class F, acts on these foliations in a really nice way. It acts by stretching and by squeezing. So what I mean by that is we have this kind of local picture of our foliations. Here we have like around a 3-pronged singular point. We have our foliations kind of coming together. Here we have away from a singular point what our foliations look like. And F acts on these by, maybe along a blue one, stretching by a factor of lambda, and along a red one by squeezing by a factor of 1 over lambda. And so this number lambda is what we call the stretch factor, or the dilatation of our pseudo-Nadsov. And so we can study something called the least dilatation in subgroups of the mapping class group. Here I denote the least dilatation for the pure braid group as this big L of PBN of SG. And this is just the infimum of the log of the dilatation for any pseudo-Nadsov pure braid. So just to point out, it is a little bit of a misnomer, because even though I say I'm studying the least dilatation, I'm studying the log of the least dilatation. And so this brings us to the main event. This is my main theorem. So I prove upper and lower bounds on the least dilatation of pseudo-Nadsov pure surface braids. And so I give upper bounds on the order of log of g over n, and these lower bounds on the order of log of g over n. And so I'll kind of talk about what these constants are more later, but they're a little bit messy, and so it's kind of easier to absorb if we just put these C and C prime placeholders for now. One thing I do want to point out is that this lower bound actually gives us a constant bound away from 0 for the least dilatation. Okay. So let's have some context. This is great, but what have other people proved about least dilatation in the mapping class group? So the first person to study the least dilatation in the mapping class group was Penner in the 90s, and he proved that if you look at the least dilatation in the mapping class group of the closed surface, then we have that the least dilatation looks like 1 over g. And so these bounds, or rather the constants in these bounds, have been improved since then, but this kind of gives you the heart of the matter, that we have this kind of asymptotic behavior going to 0 as g goes to infinity. But this is for a closed surface. What about if we look at punctures? I'm going to be considering the setting where we have punctures. And so there's this theorem of Psi from 2009. She proved that for any fixed g, at least 2, genus at least 2, then there's a constant c which depends only on the genus, which gives upper and lower bounds on the least dilatation in the mapping class group of the punctured surface, which are on the order of log n over n. And this constant has been improved since then. Psi originally proved this with an exponential dependence on genus, and that's been improved by Mehdi-Yazdi to a polynomial dependence on genus. But the main takeaway here is this kind of behavior like log n over n. So let's see where mine falls in it. So again, here we have for Penner, that the kind of punchline of Penner is that if we look at the least dilatation of the mapping class group of the closed surface, then as g gets really big, our least dilatation can get arbitrarily close to 0. And we have something similar happen in the case of punctured surface for Psi, where here instead of letting g go to infinity, if we fix g and let the number of punctures go to infinity, we again can get our least dilatation arbitrarily small. Whereas when we look in the pure surface braid group, if we fix our n, and we let our genus go off to infinity, then we can get the least dilatation is also going to go off to infinity. So somehow we're forcing this growth upwards. And then, just to note, if we kind of do the opposite, we fix the genus and we let the number of punctures go off to infinity. If you remember that those bounds, they're like on the order of g over n, it means that if we fix the genus and we have a sufficient number of punctures, so roughly twice the number of genus, then we'll actually get fixed upper and lower bounds. So somehow this behavior is a bit different. So I'm not the first person to study the least dilatation in subgroups of the mapping class group. Some other people who have done it are Chris with Benson, Fobb, and Diamogli, looking at the least dilatation in the Charlie group, the Johnson, kernel, and congruent subgroups. A recent result of Jessica Lanier and Diamogli was looking at, although they were originally studying normal generation on the mapping class group, they actually proved also that if you look at normal subgroups of the mapping class group of a closed surface, you get that the least dilatation in normal subgroups is strictly bounded away from 0. It's at least square root of 2. And then most relevant for me, Algob and Taylor, and separately Dowdle, looked at the point pushing subgroup. They studied the least dilatation here. And so I want to touch on this result. So this is the theorem. This is kind of putting together two separate results. So Dowdle studied the least dilatation of the point pushing subgroup in his thesis, relating it to self-intersection of loops, because you can think of point pushing, right, as I mentioned, is just kind of looking at a base loop and then pushing along it. And so there's a way to relate when you have a pseudo-Nassau point pushing map and when that loop you get is filling. In fact, it's a one-to-one correspondence. But we can think of point pushing as just being the one-stranded pure braid group. So Dowdle proved these log G lower bounds, and then Algob and Taylor proved also that we have log G upper bounds. And you can, okay. I lost the slide there, I think. Okay, so now let's get into like kind of the harder matter. So I lost the slide because I wanted to compare it to each other, but I think somehow that disappeared. So the struggle. So I called it the struggle not because I'm going to talk about my own sadness throughout graduate school, although I could, but because, that's the hard part of doing math, is trying to work out the details of the proof. And so that's what I want to do in this part. And I thought I should clarify so you know what you're getting into. So we'll start by looking at the upper bound. So the upper bound, these are the explicit constants. We have this 4 log of the ceiling of 2g over n plus 4 log 7. Oh, and here's the comparison, which compares very nicely to this theorem of Algob and Taylor, right? We have a very similar structure, and you'll see how that comes into play as we go through the proof of it. Okay, so the main goal when we're trying to bound this least dilatation is going to be to produce some pure surface braid which has as small a dilatation as we can manage. And so the way that we're going to do this is just by building a bunch of braids, computing the dilatations, and seeing how we can minimize this. So how can we build braids? So let's start with a setup. We're going to take 2 multi-curves, A and B, on our surface S, such that the complement of A and B is just a collection of disks. So A and B are filling multi-curves. And when I say multi-curves, I mean a collection like this, alpha 1 through alpha n, where these are simple closed curves, which are essential and pairwise disjoint. And I can use these multi-curves to build mapping classes, which I'll call multi-twists. And these are just going to be the product of all the dang twists about my simple curves in my multi-curve. So again, just a reminder, if we have a simple closed curve alpha, we can do a dang twist about alpha by cutting open our surface along alpha, doing a twist by 2 pi and gluing back together, and we can see what happens to the image of, say, beta under this dang twist. It just gets kind of wrapped around our curve alpha and then goes back along its path. So there's a really powerful theorem of Thurston to construct small dilatation pseudo-Nassau's. And it starts like this, that we have a real number mu and some homomorphism rho, which goes from the subgroup generated by the multi-twist about A and the multi-twist about B into PSL2R. And it's given very explicitly. It's given by these 2 maps just to these really nice 2x2 matrices. So again, this previous setup applies, so A and B are two filling multicurves. And then what does Thurston tell us? Thurston tells us, well, we can actually check when we have a pseudo-Naza given by the powers of these multicurves. So if we have F in the subgroup generated by the multi-twist about A and the multi-twist about B, then it's pseudo-Naza if rho of F is hyperbolic. And in fact, in that case, the dilatation of F is the largest eigenvalue of rho of F. So remember, rho of F is just a matrix in PSL2R, and so to be hyperbolic, we just mean that the absolute value of the trace is at least 2. So this is something that's pretty easy to get our hands on.
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Yes?
So, the biggest one about this tool, or maybe is this like a bar? I mean, where was mu? I forgot.
Mu is a real number greater than 1.
Any real number, or is it chosen specifically?
No, it's chosen specifically. So Thurston says there exists a real number mu greater than 1, and there exists this homomorphism.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. But we will be able to say what it is.
Okay.
Or talk about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So now we have a way to actually check, at least if we have these kind of very nice looking pseudo-Nazas, whether or not we have something that is, I guess what we have this really nice mapping class, whether or not it's pseudo-Naza. Okay, so what is the punchline? So the way that I'm going to use this is to check to kind of look at these very specific mapping classes, which are given in terms of a twist about my multicurve A and an inverse twist about my multicurve B. And so using Thurston's construction, we can say that this is pseudo-Naza, and that its dilatation is bounded above by mu plus 2. And then kind of getting to Ilya's question, we can say something about what this mu is. So this mu is the Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue of n times n transpose, where the Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue, this is just the largest in absolute value and positive eigenvalue, where this matrix N is defined just in terms of the intersection of my multicurves A and B. So it's defined such that its ith entry is given by the intersection of the ith curve of A with the jth curve of beta. So this is now something like very hands-on that we can do something with. So there's an even nicer special case. We could look at the case when we actually, instead of having multicurves, we really just have two simple cos curves. And in this case, we get that the intersection, like mu, is just the intersection squared of alpha and beta. And then if we look at the dilatation of the twist about alpha times the inverse state twist about beta, we get that it's bounded above by just the square of the intersection number plus 2. So this is kind of very handy for computing simple cases. And so this brings us to looking at what happens in the case of point pushing. So this is the construction which Algarve and Taylor did when we're just looking at the point pushing subgroup or the single-stranded braid group. So what does their construction tell us? So I'm just going to say what their construction gives us, and then I'll draw some pictures about kind of how they get their construction. So they say that we have a pair of curves, alpha and tau, which fill our twice-punctured surface, and which are homotopic to each other on our surface with a single puncture. Or what I'm really going to use this as, I'm really going to think about this most of the time, is that we have this on a surface with a single boundary component. And we have that, one, we have a really nice bound on the intersection number of alpha and tau. It's quadratic in the genus. We have, of course, already from Thurston's construction that this is pseudo-Naza, but we also have that this is actually a pure braid, which is important. And then we get, of course, this is just taking the log. We get that we have that this least dilatation. This gives us their bound on the least dilatation. Okay, so how do they actually construct this pair of curves? So the idea is pretty simple. So I'm going to do it in kind of a case that we don't actually consider, which is the case of the torus. But we kind of do. So pretend this is the boundary component instead, and I'm going to kind of tell you the story of the construction. So the idea, in general, on a genus G surface, is to take a pair of filling curves which intersect minimally. So in general, if you have a surface of genus greater than 2, that's going to be a pair of curves which intersect 2G minus 1 times. And then what we're going to do is we're going to double one of them. So in this case, I doubled alpha, and I put a point between them. between alpha and its double, which you could call its alpha prime, but it's just these red and blue curves. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to push alpha along beta. So I'm going to take my original filling curve, take its double, and then push that double along the other filling curve in that pair. So I'll just push it along, push it along, push it along. So I just like this, so it's cool. And I'm going to push it along 3 times. And I'm going to push it along 3 times, and now I'm going to have a curve alpha, and I'm going to have its image under this point pushing map. Done it 3 times, and the reason that I did it 3 times is because once I've done it 3 times, I can guarantee that alpha and its image under this point pushing actually fill my original surface. And so these are going to be my 2 curves, alpha and tau. So alpha is still alpha, and then tau is just going to be this image under the 3 times point pushing. And so why are these my 2 special curves? Well, you can see immediately that if we forget this puncture, we just unwrap back to alpha. So this is going to be something, if we take the Dane twist about alpha and tau, that the twist and the inverse Dane twist, this is not going to do anything to our surface, on the closed surface. So these are my 2 curves, and the reason that I wanted to draw this picture is because later it becomes kind of important that we have these kind of nice configuration. It kind of matters what it looks like. So this is Algov and Taylor's construction in the point pushing case. Okay, so here comes my kind of bootstrapping up to work in the case of n-stranded pure braids. So this is a proof by example, and hopefully it becomes clear kind of what you would do in general. So I'm going to do this for a genus 4 surface and an 8-stranded braid. And the idea in general is to divide your surface up into as many kind of these peripheral subsurfaces as you can of genus no more than 2g over n, which is where that 2g over n in my upper bound comes from. And then on each of these peripheral subgroups, I'm going to put an Algov-Taylor pair. So each of these, we're going to get a pair of curves, and we're going to get a mock point. And then I'm going to add an additional mock point, which is kind of, again, like I said, it's important what it looks like. It's kind of peripheral in this picture. And then I can just add extra pairs of bounding curves, these kinds of curves which just bound these 2 pairs of punctures, which are kind of closest to each other. And this is giving me a collection of red and blue curves. So the red curves is my, you could say that's my multi-curve A, my blue curves are my multi-curve B, which fill my surface. And these are curves which intersect like pairwise as small as you can get them. And so this is going to be the collection which gives me my 8-stranded pure braid on the genus 4 surface, which minimizes, well, maybe not minimizes, which at least gives my bound on the least dilatation. Okay, so this is maybe a good place to stop and see if anyone has any questions.
Which was the curve that's giving the bound in this picture?
So these multi-curves together. So the collection of red curves is going to be, say, my multi-curve A. The collection of blue curves is my multi-curve B. I'll do a multi-twist about A and then multiply it by an inverse twist about the blue curves. Yeah.
Why is that in the pure braid group?
Oh, great question. So this is in the pure braid group, right? These peripheral curves, as soon as we forget the punctures, then these are going to be trivial. And then these come from our Algov-Taylor pairs, right? So again, when we forget this puncture, this kind of just goes back to itself, and when we do a Dane twist and an inverse Dane twist, they're going to be isotopic side density. Yeah. So I guess in general, I didn't quite mention at the end of Thurston's construction, really the power of Thurston's construction, because it is built up by looking at like this eigenvalue of these matrix, which is just given by these intersections of curves, the real way to minimize that, what that eigenvalue is to minimize, like when you build these multi-curves, you want to take ones which are intersecting pairwise as low as possible, and so you don't have any one curve which kind of runs around your surface and picks up intersection with a lot of others. So you can kind of see that this is accomplishing that, at least like in some intuitive way. Okay. So this brings us to looking at the upper bound. So the upper bound, oh, so this completes, yeah. So this gives us the upper bound. So again, like this kind of idea of breaking it up into these subsurfaces of genus F most 2G over N, and then doing the Algov-Taylor construction on each of them, kind of immediately you see why we get this form for the upper bound. Okay. So now we can move on to looking at the lower bound. So this is the main reason why I used constants at the beginning, because if I didn't, it wouldn't all fit on one slide. So the lower bound is a little bit messier because it brings in kind of more different moving pieces. Okay, so let's get started.
I'm sorry. Could you go back to the slide? I cannot quite see the subscripts there. So it's the L of PP. This is N.
So this is the same. We're just looking at the least dilatation of PPN.
Okay, I was just trying to check which braid group it is. So it's PPN of SG, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And this time we do have a restriction that the genus be at least 5.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So again, like, what is our definition for our pure braids? We have this nice short exact sequence. And we are thinking of our pure braids as being the kernel of this forgetful map. So these are the ones that are isotopic to identity on the closed surface. So in particular, given some pure braid, F, we can think of what its image is on the closed surface. We can get some map. So think of this, I guess, as a homeomorphism, not as a mapping class. Then we have this theorem of Imayoshi, Ito, and Yamamoto. And they say that there exists some complex structure on your closed surface and an isotopy. So this is in the setting of given a pure braid and its image F on the big F on the closed surface. Then there exists this isotopy between the identity and F through quasi-conformal maps such that the quasi-conformal dilatation of our isotopy is bounded above by the dilatation, the pseudo-nozzle dilatation of F. And this happens for each T, so for every step of our isotopy. So this is nice because this gives us a way of moving from the pseudo-nozzle dilatation to this quasi-conformal dilatation of this isotopy. So this is my picture for that. We go from our map F, which is kind of the induced map on the closed surface, to this isotopy F sub T. And we go from looking at the pseudo-nozzle dilatation to now this quasi-conformal dilatation. And what we can do is we can pick a lift of this isotopy to the hyperbolic plane, so to the universal cover of our surface. And we then want to apply this theorem of Qua, which tells us that we can bound the quasi-conformal dilatation below by this log of the distance that any point x is moved in the hyperbolic plane by the lift of this isotopy. So we have now moved from from the quasi-conformal dilatation to somehow looking at how far points are moved in the hyperbolic plane. So here again is our picture. We're now upstairs. We take a point x. We look at its image under f tilde of t. And we now have a way to bound this quasi-conformal dilatation in terms of the maximum distance that we move a point. But we want a lower bound of our dilatation in terms of the surface topology. So we have to go back downstairs. So we go back downstairs, and we look at, again, images of points. We want to see how far is a point moved under, now the image of this isotopy. And so what does this get us, kind of putting these together, is that we can give a lower bound on the pseudo-nozzle dilatation in terms of the maximum distance that a point is moved on our surface by our isotopy. Which brings us to this theorem that I proved together with Hugo Polyday, which says that a filling graph embedded in a surface of genus G has diameter at least log of G minus 2 over 3 over 40. So how does this help us? So remember, our pure surface grades are all fixing our Mach points. And so if we think of what happens to those Mach points under the isotopy from the identity, this is going to trace out a collection of closed curves on our surface. And since we're looking at pseudo-anosovs, this tells us that we sort of have to mix up our surface everywhere. And so if we actually have a pseudo-anosov braid, if we look at what the image of those Mach points does, this is actually going to give us a collection of curves, of closed curves on a surface which fill. And so we can interpret those as this filling graph. And this tells us about kind of how far around our, like how far isotopy goes around our surface. And so since we have this bound on this filling graph, we know that at least one of our points moves at least this over n away, right? Because we have these n walk points. And so that kind of gets us this, that's kind of the idea that gives us this lower bound. And so the kind of recap, because I know there's kind of a lot of different parts in this, is that Imayoshi, Ito, and Yamamoto give us this really nice isotopy, which gives us a lower bound on our pseudonauts of dilatation in terms of the quasi-conformal dilatation. Then we have this result of Krot, which allows us to give a lower bound on the quasi-conformal dilatation in terms of the maximum point, maximum distance a point is moved under our isotopy. And then we actually say, well, let's say give a bound on how far a point has to be moved, and we do that in terms of the diameter of this filling graph. Maybe we should pause here. Ilya, is that right?
Yeah. So sorry, you got it.
Okay, sorry, okay. I was like, oh no, heavy sigh. Okay. No. Okay, so that's kind of the recap. So I guess I should pause. I think that's a good time to pause anyway, if there's like any questions about how this goes. Okay, so we have one last thing to do. This lower bound is great, but this doesn't give you what I promised at the beginning, that we have actually a constant lower bound for the least dilatation, which bounds us away from 0. And that comes in a separate step. So we do have this constant lower bound. I show that for a surface of genus at least 2, and with at least one puncture, then the least dilatation for the n-stranded pure surface braid group is bounded away from 0.
Is that bigger than 0?
It is truly bigger than 0. Like, don't squint your eyes or you'll miss it. And the way that I do this is by applying kind of just two results. So the first result that I need is a result of Ian Argel, Chris, and Dan Logley. And they showed that if you have a surface, S, and some pseudonauts of F, then the least dilatation is bounded below by this thing, where this kappa of F is the dimension of the subspace of the first real homology of S, which is fixed by S. So it's the dimension of this fixed subspace of homology. And so in order to show that I have that very tiny lower bound, I just have to show that we kind of have a large enough fixed subspace. And so what I show is that if you have a pure surface braid, then we have that it fixes at least either 2g or n-1 dimensions of homology, whichever is larger. And that's the two-step steps. So done. So kind of the next steps if you want to kind of keep looking at this pseudonauts of least dilatation for your pure surface braids would be, one, to improve that lower bound. As you may recall, the lower bound is pretty messy, and it's on the order of log of g over n. It would be really nice if we could make it the same order as the upper bound, make it log g over n. Another step in this sort of direction would be to look at the minimal asymptotic translation length of pseudonauts of pure surface braids on the curve complex. Ballard-Strenner asked me a while ago if I had thought about this. There's a paper that does this in the case of like 1 and 2 stranded braids, and they show that the minimal asymptotic translation length is 1, but there's some holes in that paper, but Ballard thinks that maybe that's a reasonable direction to go, so that could be something interesting to think about. And another thing, which is not quite related to the least dilatation question, but is related to looking at studying pure surface braids, is to study the structure of 2 generator subgroups. So this was where this project originally started, was Chris asked me as my thesis problem to look at 2 generator subgroups of the n-stranded genus pure braid group of a genus G surface. So Chris and Dan have this result for pure braids. They show that any 2 generator subgroup of the pure braid group is either free or abelian. And so that would be nice to generalize to this situation. And so that's actually a project that I have going with Sam. Hopefully, once this is done, I can start thinking about it again. So these are kind of related questions that have been mentioned to me or I would like to think about. But you're not done yet, you're not off the hook. I know next step seems like I'm done, but I would like to, before we end, tell you about a few other things that I have thought about while I've been here at Illinois. So this past year, I've actually been thinking about flat metrics a bit. In fact, particularly I've been thinking about like length spectral rigidity of flat metrics. And so kind of I'm just going to give you like a flavor. I'm not going to do any proofs. So I just want to kind of give a flavor of some other things I've been thinking about. So one question you can ask is, which curve lengths are needed to determine a flat metric on a closed surface? And so this is a question that has been thought about by other people. But first, just to say what I mean by a flat metric, a kind of nice example of like a flat metric on a surface is just looking at polygons in the plane and doing gluings of their sides. So one way we could do that would be like if we look at this L-shaped table, if we glue the parallel sides, this is going to give us a genus 2 surface with a singularity or cone point of angle 6 pi. And we can also do it with this octagon if we glue kind of by the identifications that I've color coded here. So we glue by translation and by rotation to equal pi. So a result of Chris with Anya Bankovic is that an arbitrary flat metric, so if we just look at any non-positively curved Euclidean cone metric on a closed surface, then it can be determined by the lengths of all closed curves. And here, when I say the lengths of all closed curves, I'm really talking about the marked length. So I'm talking about marked length spectrum, not just the unmarked length spectrum. And then there's also this theorem of Duchin, Chris, Moon-Duchin, Chris, and Kazuwafi, where they look at flat metrics which are kind of restricted. They come from quadratic differentials. So those are ones that are kind of like the picture I showed before, that L-shaped one where you just glue parallel sides, or also you glue parallel sides and then allow translation through angle pi. And in this case, you only need the lengths of simple closed curves. So we already see that somehow if we restrict to certain classes of flat metrics, we can get away with using less curves to determine the metric. So again, this would be an example of the type of flat metric which would be covered by that theorem. And so then what I show is that if you look at flat metrics which come from Q differentials, then you only need the lengths of Q simple curves. So I'm not going to really say much, but the idea is that if you have a surface which looks like this, so one which has, you're kind of gluing parallel sides and also allowing rotations through here instead of just angle pi, through angle 2 pi over Q, then you only need curves which are going to lift to be simple in like the holonomy-only trivializing cover, which is like a smaller set of curves than all curves, but more curves than simple curves. But in the case of just quadratic differentials, gets you back just to simple curves. So somehow it kind of generalizes the result of Chris and Moon and Kaza. And so some other questions that I'm hoping to be thinking about soon would be to answer, is this actually the right classifying set? So for Chris and Moon and Kaza, they actually showed that if you look at the set of simple curves, these are the right set. So if you take any other set of curves, which also determine your flat metric coming in quadratic differential, then they're going to be dense in the set of simple closed curves. So maybe I could do something like that for these Q simple curves. That would be nice. Somehow show that I have like the best result. Another question would be to try to think of a nice description of the closure of the set of Q simple curves if you think of them inside the set of projective geodesic currents. Or to characterize what the closure of the space of Q flat metrics looks like. So these are just some kind of open directions that I'll hopefully be thinking about soon. Okay, so that's all I have for you. I want to say before that I just thank you, all of you, for being here. You have been very important to me for a long time. I'd like to thank you to my committee, thank you to my friends, thank you to my family, and thank you very much, Chris, for being my advisor and really making this thesis happen. And yeah.
You made it happen.
No. Anyway, thank you.
There are questions for Marissa from the general audience.
I actually have a question.
Ilya, are you the general audience?
I don't know. Apparently so, in your main theorem, you have the lower bound and the upper bound. And
Yes.
I'm sort of looking at them now. So I want to think about where n is fixed, like 5.
Yes.
And you make g go to infinity. And then the difference is that in the upper bound there is basically log g, and in the lower bound there is something like log g, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, in terms of your intuition or your belief about what's the actual behavior, do you think, do you have a guess or an expectation about what's really, where the least dilatation is?
My hope that it would also be log G.
Log G.
Yeah, for the
also
low band.
double bound.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
But I wasn't able to get.
Well, no, I
Yeah.
understand lower bounds. Yes, this is good.
Yeah. But that would be the hope. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Are there other questions? All right, well, if not, the people not on the committee or the Marissa, of course.
Bye.
Head off into the sunset.